Hey, today's episode is a little different. It's just me. And I'm going to be talking about something that's shaped a huge part of my life: social anxiety. If you've ever felt that quiet or not so quiet panic in social situations, you are not alone. And I've got stories, some funny, some messy, and some that still make me cringe about how anxiety has shaped my life. So let's get into it. This is the diary of the soul, because behind every face is a story, and behind every story is a lesson. Let me take you back to second or third grade elementary school me. Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles backpack strapped to my shoulders, usually sitting right at the front of the bus, the safest spot in the universe. But one day I was late getting on, and the bus was packed. So my usual fortress of invisibility was gone, and I had to sit further back, smack in the middle, surrounded by noise, chaos, and other children, my peers, basically my natural predators. And my internal monologue as I'm stepping to the back of the bus: don't look at me, don't notice me. Let's all just pretend that I don't even go here. That whole ride, I was laser focused on one thing: my stop. I wasn't going to miss it. I was on the edge of my seat, ready to launch up before we even got to my house. But then, as we rolled closer, something strange happened. The bus driver didn't stop. In fact, my house came and went. You know those balloon animals you see people twisting tighter and tighter, and the whole time you believe they're just one wrong move away from making them pop? That's the familiar tightness I felt in my chest. And my brain screamed at me to say something, but my body froze, just locked in place in that seat. And I had this intense feeling of dread that if I spoke up, everybody was going to stare at me. So instead of doing the obvious thing, I did what I thought was the safer thing. I sank back into my seat, pulled my backpack onto my lap, and I tried to disappear. As I watched my house go by, my heart just sank deeper because I didn't have a plan. I didn't know where we were going. I just stayed quiet. I stayed quiet as we moved further and further away from my neighborhood, quiet as we headed deeper into unfamiliar territory, quiet as I realized I had absolutely no plan for what to do when the bus eventually emptied out. And I couldn't shake the feeling that I was absolutely going to be in trouble if I didn't fix this. Looking back, it's not the fact that I missed my stop that sticks with me. It's that I knew I should have spoken up, but fear of being noticed outweighed the fear of being lost. And it's that tension, the constant tug of war between wanting to do the right thing and wanting to stay invisible, that defines so much of what it's been like living with social anxiety. Social anxiety is sneaky like that. It doesn't always show up as these big dramatic meltdowns. Sometimes it's in those quiet, everyday moments, staying silent instead of raising my hand, avoiding eye contact to dodge conversations, or over rehearsing a simple hi like it's a TED talk. For me, that bus ride was one of the many times anxiety convinced me that disappearing was safer than being seen, even if being invisible was to my detriment. And you'll hear it's a pattern that followed me well into adulthood, shaping how I move through the world. And look, I am no therapist. I like to think of myself as at least occasionally emotionally intelligent, but to be real, I'm still figuring this shit out like everyone else. What I can do is offer my own experience with anxiety and let you pick the bones of that to see what resonates with you. In this episode, I want to talk about what it's like living with social anxiety, the absurd, the uncomfortable, the oddly hilarious. We'll get into all the adolescent shenanigans, the books that saved me, the CBD that betrayed me, and the awkward triumph of reading a wedding poem in Amsterdam. This isn't about tidy solutions or miracle cures. It's messy. Um, it's unglamorous, and it's the process of figuring out how to coexist with anxiety. Like living with a grumpy roommate who won't pay rent but also won't move out. So stick around. Whether you've been battling your own anxiety or just want to hear a story that involves a rogue gummy and some questionable public digestion, I promise you there's something here for you. Let's kick things off with our opening tradition. So I invite you to think about what's one thing, big or small, that brought you some joy recently. If you want to hear mine, it's that I wrote something down, not on my phone, not on my laptop, like actually wrote it down with a pen in one of those beautiful notebooks I have that have just been sitting there like stage props. And there's something different about handwriting. When I type, my thoughts can sprint ahead and they usually start to tumble over themselves. But when I write by hand, they have to slow down to take shape. There's a kind of intimacy to it. The physical act of forming letters somehow forms the idea too. It's messier, slower. I mean, I cross things out, I underline things, I circle sentences and try to move them to different parts on the page with arrows, but it feels more true. So that's been my joy. Now, I guess it's time for the chaos of some childhood trauma. There's a moment in almost every superhero origin story where the suit gets forged, you know? Mine wasn't made of Kevlar or iron. It was constructed out of hypervigilance and overthinking. I can trace my first vivid memory of it back to first grade. My teacher, Miss Stansberry, was reading aloud to the class while we sat cross legged on the carpet. And being read to was a top tier experience for me as a kid, second only to gym class, specifically the days when they'd haul out that massive rainbow parachute. You remember the one? You know, that giant nylon rainbow fabric that we all used to throw up high in the air with our classmates, like we're a bunch of tiny wizards summoning this dome of joy. Um, and then we would take turns running underneath it like it was a portal to another dimension. You know, that is always gonna be pure childhood bliss for me. But being read to was a solid runner up. And on this particular day, Miss Stansberry narrated one of my favorite books from childhood, Wayside School is Falling Down. And I was listening to the stories from that book. I felt this sudden undeniable urge to use the bathroom. Now, the bathroom is just outside the classroom, which means I'd have to raise my hand and ask for permission to go. And that, listeners, is where the real problem began. Because even at that age, raising my hand felt terrifying. It felt overwhelming and it felt full of consequences. You know, that's what my anxious brain told me. And here's the thing about kids and bathroom urges, they're not great at estimating how long they can hold it. Long story short, I learned two things that day. One, there will be at least 2 times in my life when I shit my pants. This was the first. The sequel won't come until my 30s. More on that later. 2, I could have spoken up, solved the problem, and saved myself the shame, but that would have required attention. And at that age, attention felt synonymous with danger. So I made the trade, dignity for invisibility. And here's the thing, that reaction, freezing instead of speaking up, didn't come out of nowhere. My nervous system, already at 6 or 7 years old, had already been training for that moment. The thought of drawing attention to myself, of everyone turning to look at me, even just to raise my hand to use the bathroom, was scary because so many of the experiences of kids paying attention to me translated to negative reactions already. Even before I fully understood why, I knew I was different at a very young age, and somehow so did the other kids. I can't remember the specifics of every early insult, but I remember the stings, the way laughter could turn on me for how I carried myself or for how I talked. So I learned early that invisibility was the safest superpower that I had. I later learned in therapy that anxiety is a nervous system still running an outdated operating system. And that tracks because even in first grade, the software was already installing, and the instructions were never draw attention, never ask for help. It's not worth the risk. That script didn't just appear, it was written by tiny social injuries of side eyes, of snickers, of classmates who clocked that I didn't quite fit in and made sure that I never forgot it. And the real kicker, that software didn't stop running for years and years. From pre K to high school, the message was reinforced over and over. You're safer when you stay small. And I just started designing my life around it. At this point, maybe you're thinking, wait, was that really anxiety? Yes. Yes, it was. It may not be wearing the outfit you expected because social anxiety isn't always dramatic. It's not always panic attacks or hives or hyperventilating into a paper bag. It can be those things. I think it affects people to varying degrees. For some, it's a whispers. For others, it's a scream. For me, it's a stealth operator showing up in subtle, everyday decisions, staying silent instead of raising my hand, avoiding eye contact, mentally rehearsing what I'm going to say so I can do it perfectly. And it's not just about being shy, it's about the threat response that gets activated when there is no threat. It's my nervous system treating walking to a room alone like being chased by velociraptors or something. My brain spins out into what I like to call the spotlight effect, where I'm thinking everybody is watching me and how I do something and how can I escape from this, even if all I'm trying to do is find somewhere to sit. One thing I learned in therapy was this: anxiety gains power when I see it through its lens only. But when I can say, I'm experiencing anxiety right now instead of I'm an anxious person, I create distance and take my power back. So let's call it what it is. Not me being broken, not me being dramatic, just my brain trying a little too hard to keep me safe. And once I learned how to see it for what it is, not who I was, everything started to shift. Of course, I didn't have that clarity or even language back then to articulate all this. As I grew up amongst my peers, I was just trying to make it through lunch without being perceived. In high school, my strategy for avoiding the social minefield of the cafeteria was simple: beat the system. Most mornings, I'd rush to the library, sign up for a pass, and that little slip of paper was my golden ticket to eat lunch surrounded by the whispers of pages and books instead of the echo of lunchroom chaos. While other kids navigated friend groups and flirted, I was busy reading about the schemes of the Lannisters long before they became HBO's pop culture darlings, or double checking the mailbox for my overdue Hogwarts acceptance letter, or trying to survive Dune without getting eaten by a sandworm. I felt like I was in a fantasy witness protection program because books were more than an escape. Those hours hiding among the stacks, secretly snacking on Cool Ranch Doritos and my homemade ham and cheese sandwich, they taught me how to disappear, but they also taught me how to imagine. Looking back, I think my love for stories had less to do with wanting to live in a fantasy world and more to do with wanting to live in a world where I belonged. A lot of those books had characters who felt out of place too, who were weird, brave, brilliant, misunderstood, and they weren't punished for it. They were transformed by it, actually. And then, unexpectedly, there was also coding. I didn't excel in school. I thought I was stupid, to be honest. I had trouble organizing my thoughts and I had trouble with memorization and parroting back to teachers what they wanted to hear. And I remember one of my English teachers in high school gave me a negative grade on an essay, not a zero, less than a zero, meaning that absence of effort would have literally been an improvement. But in my junior year, I enrolled in Intro to Java and something clicked. I don't know if it was just the logic or the structure of learning a language, or the way the computer responded when I got that language to do what it was that I wanted it to do. It just lit up a different part of my brain. I was just problem solving with syntax. And I remember my first big project using Java 5. I created an interactive game where you had to find Waldo in a crowded image of 90s cartoons. And the mouse pointer turned into crosshairs. And when you found Waldo, the program I wrote played an applause sound and randomly placed Waldo somewhere else on the screen. And I had spent hours and hours reading through documentation and making sure my code worked. And for the first time, I didn't feel like I was performing. I felt like I was participating. And the tech world was very different back then. I mean, for starters, there was no Chat GPT, there was no vibe coding, there was no Stack Overflow. It was this niche, nerdy arena that was just starting to grow into something bigger. But one of those things I appreciated most about coding at the time was that the tech environment gave me a kind of permission I didn't know I needed. Conversations often happen through messaging apps, even when we were sitting next to each other, which felt oddly comforting. Silence wasn't awkward, it was just part of the rhythm. The sound of clicking keyboards became my background music. And it was a reminder that connection didn't have to be loud or performative. Even Even the social awkwardness of other programmers felt like a comforting baseline. No one was scanning me for social cues or calling me off. We were all a little off. That was the point. And maybe the biggest thing, I wasn't measured by how I looked or presented myself. I was measured by how I approached a problem and how I kept trying. For someone who spent years scanning rooms for threats, trying to disappear and shrink and contort to fit in, this was the first time I felt like I could expand. So, if books helped me dream a way out, coding helped me start to believe I could build one. Of course, not all my coping tools were so constructive. If books and coding were my early ways of sidestepping anxiety, drinking was my first real attempt to silence it altogether. And at that time, it worked, and it worked spectacularly. I mean, I didn't start drinking until I was 17. When I had my first drink, the moment it hit, I'd felt like I'd unlocked a secret level. My thoughts slowed down, my shoulders dropped. I could talk to people without rehearsing everything in my head beforehand. It was like someone had finally found the dimmer switch on my internal chaos and turned it down. Cue Bacardi 151. If you're unfamiliar, 151 wasn't just a drink. It was an industrial solvent. It just was disguised and packaged as rum. I mean, this bottle came with a built-in flame protector, which tells you everything you need to know. This wasn't the kind of liquor you casually sipped. It was 75.5% alcohol, basically fire in a shot glass. Your throat burns, your eyes water. It's a whole production. And in true chaotic fashion, 151 has since been discontinued. I looked it up because of course I did, and Bacardi's official website has essentially written a eulogy for it. They say some things are just better left to the imagination. We felt it was best for everyone to let Bacardi 151 slink away into the night and transform into the shadowy creature of legend it has become, which, let's be honest, that's all corporate speak for y'all couldn't handle it and we're tired of being named in all these goddamn lawsuits. And, honestly fair. But here's the thing about 151, it worked for me. And that's why I can still vaguely remember many a night in my friend Amanda's dorm room taking shots of it while we pre-gamed for yet another house party. Now, everyone has that friend that I like to call the corrupter, or for better branding, the recreational life coach. Amanda was mine. She opened the door to weed and booze. And to be clear, this is not a blame narrative. I was primed and ready for corruption. I mean, up until then, I'd been on a bit of a moral high horse, scoffing at substances, which I largely blame Dare and all of their commercials. And the truth of it, I guess, when I really think about it, is that I didn't resist the usual teenage temptations because I was good. It was just that I was indoors. I spent most of my nights at home in high school. And so, in that environment, it's easier to resist peer pressure or temptation. And then college happened, and Bacardi 151 happened. And after chugging it back, it felt like the rum was tearing the lining off my throat. I'd get this burn that lingered for hours after a shot. And for a while, my nasal passages felt like I'd snorted red pepper. But something magical would happen. My anxiety dulled. And in some cases, it vanished completely. It was like someone had hit mute on a speaker, blaring insecurities at full volume. And what it left behind was a version of me that felt unshackled. I wasn't overthinking. I wasn't holding myself back. I wasn't thinking about the spotlight effect. I was radiating confidence like a goddamn supernova. Talking to strangers, easy. Dancing in front of people, thriving. It gave me social energy and abundance. I was out until stupid o'clock doing things I wouldn't even think about sober. And it's funny looking back at how proud I was of my drunken confidence. Like, look at me, I'm a real human being who can say words and interact with other people and everything. But Yeah, I was still a hot mess, you know? You just couldn't tell me nothing back then, and honestly, that's part of the magic of that age, I think. It's socially acceptable to be sloppy. I think it's almost kind of expected. Everyone's mistakes become currencies, and you swap them like badges of honors amongst your friends the next morning. And yeah, of course, I clung to drinking because drinking felt like the cheat code to life. And it was easy to do that because it's so socialized. Drinking wasn't part of the plan, it was the plan. I danced with it, I brunched with it, I laughed and caught up with friends over it. Alcohol didn't sit on the sidelines, it was the glue that held my entire social identity together. It gave me permission to be daring or dazzling, and for a long time, I didn't question that. But here's the thing about most vices, they're balancing equations. At first, especially when you're young, the equation feels fair. I'd borrow a little joy on Friday night, and Saturday would gently tap on my door to collect. But as I got older, the math got messier. The math, it just wasn't mathin'. And hangovers graduated from being these minor inconveniences to a full-blown 2-day punishments. And that's having developed, my rituals, like eating a big meal before drinking and alternating water between cocktails, or at least, trying to remember that was the idea. Popping some vitamin B12 and chugging electrolytes. I had this whole drinking survival checklist, but it didn't matter how meticulous I was, drinking always sent me a bill. And the spotlight I thought I dimmed for a night, it would come roaring back the next morning, just brighter and more unforgiving. And this time it was in a new form, the form of anxiety. That really lovely cocktail of being hungover and deeply anxious about what I said, did, or didn't remember from the night before. And so I was caught in this cycle where I'd swear off drinking for a bit until the next time. And it took me a long time to really look at what this cycle was in my life and what it was costing me. And when I finally removed it, a lot of things shifted, including the relationship I was in at the time. I remember my ex nitpicking how I was acting at a party one night. He said, "You're just different since you stopped drinking. You're not fun anymore." That hit like cold water to the face. Yeah, I was essentially getting a Yelp review of my personality, and it was giving 2 stars. The worst part, he wasn't wrong, at least not wrong in that I was different, because without alcohol, I wasn't this effortlessly gregarious, charming version of myself I'd grown used to performing. But here's what I know now. Drinking didn't create a new version of me. It just made it easier to access parts of myself I didn't think existed sober. Now, when I'm out with friends, I'm usually sipping on sparkling water. I still occasionally drink. Um, and the anxiety is still there. The spotlight still feels hot. And I'm still learning how to pull or like summon that version of me to the surface without the accelerant. It's harder. It doesn't come in smooth, glowing waves like it used to, but it's real and it's sustainable. And also, I definitely don't miss spending half my weekends hungover. What I do miss, though, if I'm being completely honest, is how easy it all felt. How effortless it was to slip past the fear and friction and be a more whimsical, magnetic version of myself. Drinking made me brave, but sobriety is teaching me I can be brave on my own terms. And that I've learned is a far more valuable skill to have. Now, drinking was my first substance at managing anxiety. My second attempt, years later, was CBD. You know, the miracle compound that's supposed to relax you, balance your energy, and maybe turn you into a slightly better version of yourself without the paranoia that comes with its rowdier sibling, THC. People swear by it. I'd read all the glowing reviews of people boosting this up. Oh my God, CBD is a game changer. It's just like my anxiety floats away. And I thought, okay, great, sign me up. I want to float too. And if you're one of those floating people, I'm genuinely happy for you, if not a little bit jealous, because my foray into the realm of CBD was more catastrophic than I would have liked. Let me explain. I had just bought a pack of 50 milligram CBD gummies. Because I skew toward nerdy and like to follow the rules, I decided to start small. You know, I popped half of one of the gummies into my mouth right in the shop. You know, I had dealt with anxiety for my entire life, so I was ready to float into my anxiety free era immediately. Plus, I walked out the shop thinking this will be a good trial run because I've got some errands to run so then I can see how CBD works for me when I'm out in public. The first stop, the grocery store, that was uneventful. You know, actually, I wasn't even sure it was working yet, but then I started like vibing a bit as I loaded my groceries into the trunk. You know, I got in the car and the sun felt brighter, you know, it was warming my skin, the windows were down, my Frank Ocean radio was coming through for me. Life just felt calm and good. And then my stomach spoke. Just a little rumble. I thought, it's just a fart. You know, I'll let it sneak through. We'll keep it moving. I'll be fine. It wasn't fine. Um, yeah, it wasn't fine at all. Because what I thought was a fart turned out to be so much more than that. Look, I'll spare you the details because I do have some dignity, even though this is now the second time I'm telling you that I shit my pants. It's like my body sat me down and said, "You think you're grown up? Because let me remind you who you really are." And my anxiety at that moment, it was gone. So I will give CBD that. It was just not the loudest voice at the moment because my crippling pride was the thing that needed to be addressed. Not only did I have to process the betrayal of my body, I had to sit in it for the rest of the drive home as I aborted the remainder of my public appearances. Now, you'd think this incident might have been enough for me to give up on CBD entirely, but no. I'm nothing if not loyal to a process. So I kept trying it. And to be fair, it wasn't all bad. If nothing else, it made me very regular, which I guess counts as a wellness win. And it did leave me feeling physically relaxed. But here's the thing, my mental and emotional responses to anxiety, they didn't go anywhere. Sure, I felt calmer in my body, but my brain didn't get the memo. You know, I still had all these racing thoughts and hyper awareness of my surroundings. And eventually, I realized the real issue. I wasn't just looking for relief, I was on a quest for removal. I wanted something straight out of a fantasy novel, you know, some kind of spell or amulet that could banish anxiety entirely, the same way alcohol once could. But here's what I've learned in therapy since: calm isn't always the goal. It's a nice to have, don't get me wrong, but it's not a need to have. You don't build peace by erasing noise, you build it by learning how to move forward even when the noise is still humming. So, no, CBD wasn't a magic spell, but it didn't fail me either. It just exposed that I was using a faulty metric to measure my progress. You know, I thought that if I didn't feel completely 100% chill. I was doing something wrong. Like my nervous system was broken, like I was broken. But what I really needed wasn't a mute button. I needed resilience, the ability to feel tension and hear the thoughts, but ride the wave and keep going anyway. So I walked away from that experience with two essential truths. One, anxiety is deeply personal. You find what works by trying, failing, and, in my case, sometimes sacrificing your dignity to the gods of chaos. And number two, never trust a fart. That season of experimenting, both with substances and expectations, taught me that I didn't need better distractions. I needed a better framework, not trusting edibles in internet forums, not freelancing as my own therapist, but actually letting someone with maybe some credentials assess the situation. But, this didn't happen into my 30s that I decided to call in the professionals for my anxiety. And therapy gave me something I wasn't expecting, a revelation about my brain. I know. Turns out it's not broken. It's actually very good at its job. As I learned in therapy, the brain is essentially a hyper vigilant cartographer. It's constantly drawing maps of your reality. And these maps start forming in childhood and they're influenced by relationships, experiences, and maybe that one time your kindergarten crush rejected your makeshift Valentine because you use way too much of that Elmer's color glue. Your brain learns from these experiences and it learns what to do to avoid bad outcomes and what might bring good ones. Once it's locked in a map, whether from one big powerful event or countless smaller ones, it's like, okay, cool, got it. No edits needed, lock it down. Which, evolutionarily speaking, that makes sense to me because for most of human history, the world you were born into was the world you die in. If your tribe was 50 people, you had to know how to navigate those 50 people. Now it's like your family, your coworkers, your dating app pool, your HOA, your study abroad friends, your online followers, et cetera, et cetera. And the ties within those groups are constantly changing. So, no, my anxiety wasn't a glitch. It was a highly functional alarm system installed by a younger version of me who'd learned from the teasing, from the micro traumas, that invisibility was the safest bet. And when I finally reframed it that way, that anxiety wasn't some foreign invader or a personal failure, that it was the younger me doing the best he could with the information he had at the time, I just was a bit more forgiving to myself. And now that I'm older, safer, better equipped, I can update the map. And with that perspective, I started collecting tools, not miracle cures or personality overhauls, just small, repeatable practices that helped me stay present, grounded, and oftentimes more joyful. So let's talk about those next. Tool number one, box breathing. One of the simplest yet surprisingly effective tools I found is box breathing. And it's exactly what it sounds like. I breathe in, I hold, I breathe out, and I pause. Four even steps, like tracing the sides of a square. I usually go with 5 seconds per side, but you can adjust it depending upon your lung capacity or general vibe. So, why does this work? Anxiety has this annoying habit of hijacking my fight or flight system, and that cranks up my heart rate. It speeds up my breathing and basically makes me feel like a cornered animal. Suddenly, I'm a gazelle in a David Attenborough documentary, and that's the case even though the threat could just be showing up to a place early and awkwardly waiting alone for a friend to show up, who I'm convinced isn't just late, they've somehow died obviously. And what's even more tragic is that meanwhile, everyone around me has noticed and clocked my loneliness because, of course, they have nothing better to do than to study me. But it's not just studying, they're also silently judging and they're waiting because they've orchestrated an elaborate flash mob to close in on my table, point and chant, "Look at the loser who got stood up," because clearly that's what strangers do in their spare time. It's not enough to just feel awkward. I must be publicly humiliated and turned into a cautionary tale for anyone considering going out in public alone. I know this is not a logical response. This is my body reacting, and then my imagination trying to fill in the blanks for why. And box breathing helps shut it down by giving my nervous system a different assignment, something new to focus on because it activates my body's chill mode, aka the parasympathetic nervous system. And it does that by deepening my breath and slowing my heart rate. And it's like, hey, we're breathing like a calm person, so maybe we're not under attack by an invisible jury of strangers. It's a small act of rebellion, really. Instead of fighting the anxiety, I give it space to exist and then I regulate around it because trying not to feel anxious never worked for me. But learning to move through anxiety while calming my body, that, I can do that. I first discovered box breathing thanks to Andrew Huberman. He breaks it down like the science nerd that we all aspire to be. And he explains how this simple technique can dial down your brain's hyperactivity and boost your calm and can even have impacts on your sleep. It's not just feel good advice. He covers in the episode how it's backed by studies, and I'll drop the link in the show notes if you want to geek out with him. I box breathe while I gear up for a meeting where I have to present, or when braving a social setting where I don't know anyone, or just to ground myself on a stressful day. Because look, it's portable, it's free, it's science backed, and it reminds me that I don't need to feel perfectly calm to function. I just need a little gap between me and the panic gazelle so that I can give space for the chill llama to meander in. Next up, tool number two, meditation. Now, I know what you're thinking. Meditation? Groundbreaking. And that's kind of how it felt at first. I had downloaded the apps, lit the incense, maybe even convinced myself I needed a meditation cushion, which, let's be honest, is just an expensive floor pillow. And with all these things, I tried to find inner peace. And I thought the goal was to empty my mind, to have zero thoughts. But it's actually about noticing when your brain wanders off into any thought and gently telling it that I see this happening, labeling it. I label it as thinking. And by doing so, I then pull my mind back to my breath, back to my body. That's the entire practice. That's the rep. You get lost in thought, you notice, you come back, you do it again. Every time you return, I like to think of it as a tiny act of self leadership. And for someone who has constant chatter in my mind, this practice became important. So, for about 10 minutes, 3 times a week, I sit down and focus on the sensation of breathing and how the breathing feels going in and out of my nostrils. And every time, no matter how many times I have a thought pop up, I acknowledge every thought as thinking and gently pull my attention back to my breath. Now, you can actually make this practice even simpler by just counting your breaths from 1 to 50. So you inhale on 1, exhale on 2, inhale on 3, exhale on 4, and so on. And if you lose count, that's fine. That means the meditation is working because you noticed. You just start at 1 again. And this practice is like tapping the brain on the shoulder and saying, hey, we're doing something else now. And the real nugget of wisdom I gleaned from meditation is that it's not about sitting still for a set number of minutes and focusing on your body. It's about bringing a meditative aspect to your entire life. I sort of see it like this. I meditate to practice being an observer of my own inner world so that when I go out to participate in the outer world, I have this mechanism that can help me ride the waves of my internal thoughts and emotions. And so I'm not so reactive. Meditation taught me a better way. Instead of reacting to every thought, I started recognizing them for what they are, just thoughts. They are not commands, they're not truths, they're fleeting visitors. Meditation gave me a perch I can use to view myself. And here's the magic: when I stopped defaulting to this mode of shutting down whenever I felt anxious, I could see something on the other side. There was light at the end of this tunnel vision. And my anxiety started passing by like watching an obnoxious tailgater finally take a turn in my rearview mirror. Still annoying, but someone else's problem, no longer mine. Maybe some people are wired this way already, but maybe it's a skill and it's learnable. And for me, now it's improvable. I started with David Nichtern's meditation for everyday life course. And what I love about David is that he strips away any mystical fluff and gets straight to the point. Meditation is about training your mind to be calm and compassionate to yourself. He has a practical and approachable introduction to meditation. And it was a course that stuck with me amidst all the other options I had found. And so I'll link his course and some of his podcast appearances on the Duncan Trussell Family Hour in the show notes because his vibe might just be your vibe too. The last major tool I started using is what I like to call bribery, not the felony kind, the psychological kind. Because look, anxiety is loud for me. It's the person who never shuts up at the party and only wants to rant and talk about worst case scenarios. And I realized if I was going to keep showing up despite that noise, I needed a damn good reward system. So I started giving myself metaphorical gold stars. If I danced between sets at the gym and didn't care who watched, or at least didn't obsess over it, gold star. If I initiated a conversation while out and about, even if it was a simple hello and it went nowhere, another gold star. If I showed up to a social event where I didn't know anyone and stayed for at least an hour, two gold stars, and maybe even a cookie. It might sound small, but rewarding those moments help balance the equation because anxiety, at least for me, focuses so intensely on what could go wrong. And I had to get better at noticing what went right, even if no one else noticed, even if the win was just, well, you didn't flee this time. My brain has spent decades creating a mental highlight reel of embarrassment, rejection, and social flops. But I had to consciously edit in some of these wins that were just being glossed over. And that's how I updated my map. That's how I showed my nervous system, hey, we're not under siege. Sometimes we're just doing our best, and that's worth something. It's classical conditioning, really. Pavlov had his bells. I've got my stickers and cookies. Last year, I did something that would have made 6-year-old me spit out his juice box and demand to speak to a chaperone. I took a solo trip around the world. 9 countries, countless adventures, and a level of independence I didn't know I had in me. And here's the wildest part. Most of the time, I wasn't anxious. I was free. I felt capable, unfettered. It was like I'd slipped into a version of myself I'd always suspected was there, but never fully trusted. Sure, I met up with some cherished friends along the way, but The bulk of that journey, it was just me, my suitcase, and this surprising new feeling, confidence, you know? Um, the kind that doesn't need applause or gold stars, just the knowledge that I can do big, scary things on my own. That trip was a living, breathing marker of change. But if I had to pick one moment that encapsulated all of it, it would be this: standing in front of over 70 people at a wedding in Amsterdam, reading a poem I'd written for two of my best friends tying the knot. Let me set the scene. I was there, holding my poem, palms are sweaty, in the 8 Mile Way, and I'm staring out at a mix of familiar and unfamiliar faces. And then I start to read, even though I felt like my body was on fire. I was terrified, but I wasn't just terrified, I was also excited. I wasn't just anxious, I was energized. This was a poem I loved, something I'd written carefully and edited and practiced with heart. And for the first time, I didn't just read the words, I invoked them. I let them live in my voice. And one of the things I think that I picked up in therapy was that anxiety and excitement are essentially twins, identical on the outside, but different in intention. The heart races, the breath quickens, the energy surges. The only real difference is the story I attach to those bodily functions. So in that moment, I decided to tell a different story. I wasn't afraid, I was ready. This wasn't panic, it was passion dressed in adrenaline, and it worked. People came up to me after, friends, strangers, friends of strangers, and told me how deeply it moved them. Not just the writing, but the delivery, and that I connected with the audience. One person said that I should even consider doing spoken word at weddings full time. And for someone who spent most of their life convinced that being perceived was a threat, that was a moment I won't forget. It was the result of slow, steady microdoses. Like the time I stood up at a friend's birthday and read something personal out loud, or when I gave a toast on a group trip to Greece, even with a knot in my chest and my voice cracking. Each time I was building tolerance, rewriting the old script, the one that said I'd always be the anxious kid who froze, who hid, who held everything in. And now I don't feel like I'm at war with my anxiety anymore. If anything, it feels more like catching up with an old friend that I've grown apart from, who used to speak for me and now just occasionally interrupts. That doesn't mean anxiety isn't gone. The nerves still come, especially in new or overstimulating settings, but those aren't the loudest voices anymore. They don't get the final word. These days, I'm the one holding the mic more often. For most of my life, I thought anxiety was something I could conquer, like a boss level in a video game. If I did all the things right, spoke up more, meditated, mastered box breathing, hit the gym, ate kale, went to therapy, then surely anxiety would just vanish. But that's not how this works. I don't expect anxiety to pack its bags and leave anytime soon. And honestly, that's the reality of the situation. I've stopped waiting for the day I wake up and feel completely unbothered. A more realistic goal is to stop letting it run the whole damn operating system that is Alvin. I've learned it's about boundaries. I don't let anxiety take over the apartment anymore. It doesn't get the remote. It doesn't decide if I RSVP. The freedom I felt while traveling wasn't because anxiety magically disappeared. It was because for once I didn't let it dictate my actions. And that moment at the wedding, reading my poem aloud, it wasn't proof that I was cured. It was proof that I could be seen. I could take up space and still stay intact. even with anxiety tagging along. And in a weird way, anxiety and I have come to a kind of understanding. Not peace exactly, but cohabitation. And for now, that's enough. I've also learned a couple of things along the way. First, there are no quick fixes. I know it's not the motivational quote you came here for, but I think it's the truth. Anxiety isn't a puzzle to solve. It's a relationship to manage. And like all relationships, it takes efforts, maintenance. You need to establish boundaries. And sometimes you maybe need a little bit of couples counseling. And second, empathy for where I am and anything that I take on in my life is key for success. For years, I berated myself for not being braver, for not pushing through my comfort zone sooner. But progress for me doesn't come from force. It came from me taking a step back, looking around and admitting, okay, this is where I am. And then from there, I can start change. I can microdose discomfort. I can take on a little more than felt safe. And then a little more again. And it's not a leap, it's not a fast forward, it's just a slow, deliberate stacking of courage. Anxiety might have stunted my social growth, but it also led me to two of my greatest passions. When I retreated from the world, I found sanctuary in books. And when I needed a safe haven in high school, I discovered coding. It closed some doors for sure, but it opened others I might have never walked through otherwise. So when I look back now, surprisingly, I don't see a trail of shit or awkward moments. I see evidence that I've grown, that I've gone from hiding in libraries to traveling solo, from shrinking myself to invoking my words in front of a room full of strangers and friends. And if you're in the thick of it, where I once was, this is what I'll leave you with. You're not behind. You are definitely not broken. You're exactly where you need to be. Progress doesn't look like a movie montage. It looks like showing up one tiny brave moment at a time. It's built in those quiet, imperfect choices. When you take a breath, when you say the thing, when you do it scared. Anxiety might always be part of my story, but it doesn't get to write the ending. That part is up to me. And it's up to you too. Peace. If you've made it this far, thank you. Really. This episode marks the end of season 1 of this podcast, and it's been a season filled with honest conversations, curious questions, and stories that didn't always have tidy endings. Every single episode was a dialogue I once would have been too anxious to initiate, and yet, here we are. So, if you ever need proof that anxiety doesn't get the final word, this whole damn show is it. If an episode resonated with you or made you think of someone else, send it their way. That one small act might be the support they didn't know they needed, and it helps me too. Every share, every signal you send out into the sea of algorithms keeps this little ship afloat, so I can keep having these conversations. And maybe, just maybe, you'll hear your story in them too. Until next time.